All right, what's good, people? Ninja To Viaduct back at it again. My name is Andrew, and tonight I'm running solo. But fear not, this really just gives me an opportunity to try out a different form of content and just see how it goes. But in any case, for tonight's talk story, I guess I'm going to be doing a vlog, or I don't know what even constitutes as a vlog nowadays. In either case, I'm just going to go ahead and dial in on a specific topic, and I'm just going to run with it, and we'll see where it goes. So, without further ado, let's dive in. So, a couple weeks back in early October, there was the official announcement for a new Avatar open world RPG. When I say Avatar, I don't mean Blue People and James Cameron. I mean Nickelodeon, Paramount, Last Airbender, Legend of Korra. So that official announcement came out in early October. A few days later, or maybe even like a week later, I'm not entirely sure when it was officially posted, but on the Avatar podcast with Dante Bosco and Janet Varney. These were voice actors for Avatar: The Last Airbender as well as Legend of Korra, but they were able to share an exclusive with a couple of new updates to the actual game itself. This included things like story beats, just sort of what the general conflict might be, as well as some concept art. Now, I'll say this about Avatar and The Last Airbender world, but this is one of my favorite sort of fantasy worlds to just sort of exist in. I think there's so much potential that could be here, and I'm ultimately just really stoked that Paramount is starting to capitalize on this a bit more, just because I think there could be so much here. Now, I will preface this that when my fandom for the Avatar world really revolves around television shows. I've dabbled in the comic books here or there, but really haven't followed it super closely. Same thing with the books and any of the other games prior to this particular announcement. It just didn't necessarily click for me. But in any case, with this open world RPG, this has always kind of been my dream for like a really long time. As, since the early days of After the Last Airbender, definitely during the Legend of Korra age, I always wanted to be able to play an open world game, be my own avatar, and just sort of traverse the world. But before I kind of dive into my own personal thoughts about what I would want to see in something like this, or what I think could be possible for something like this, let's just talk about what we know based off of the initial announcement, but also in the podcast announcement as well. But it's being developed by a AAA studio, Saber Interactive. Might touch on to them if I'm not mistaken. They did the World War Z game, and I think most recently they did the Warhammer Space Marine 2 game, which seemingly is being well received, so that's awesome to hear. The game itself is going to be an open world RPG. You're able to create your own character, your own avatar from scratch, more or less. And there are really going to be no limitations to any nation or bending, for that matter. As of right now, the working title is Ice World, Ice Wars, and sort of the inciting incident that is kind of happening during this period is that it is during an ice age as well. The release window is set to be about 2027 to 2028, although um, they did say don't hold them to that date per se. It is possible that they could be extended and pushed back and further. Which, if that's the case, that's fine. I know development takes long, and really, I just want them to be able to nail this. But in addition to that, it is expected to be on PC and next gen consoles. Now, as for some story beats that we know, like I mentioned earlier, it is set to be in an ice age. It's set roughly about 7,000 years prior to Legend of Korra, Last Airbender. And from what we know, um, Avatar 1's age, the first Avatar, he was set about 10,000 years prior to the events of Legend of Korra and such. So it's definitely an interesting time period to be in. I think it is far removed enough from where we ultimately know a lot of these characters and a lot of the world. And so they have a lot of flexibility to kind of just play around and explore and push certain boundaries or add to the lore overall without necessarily being hindered by trying to adhere to the rules that were set up in Last Airbender as well as Legend of Korra. But in either case, more on that a little bit later. Um, in addition to being 7,000 years ago, Ice Age, there was some type of volcanic eruption that's involved in some way. I can't recall if it has to do or if the volcano itself started the Ice Age or happened during the Ice Age, but I'm sure we'll find out in due time. During the podcast, they also revealed some concept art that included a snowy mountain biome with a dragon flying over a erupting volcano, and kind of center mass to the concept art, you have a sort of Fire Nation type individual, and they're sort of looking out towards the volcano and you can see in the distance what looks to be a squad of waterbenders. Now, whether or not the waterbenders are there to deal with this Fire Nation like individual or the volcano itself remains to be clarified. But definitely an interesting concept art review. Now, that's basically all we know so far with the initial announcement and the podcast. But what questions do we have after seeing this, or what questions do I have after seeing this? Well, I really want to know what exactly the world looks like at this point in time. How is society going to be different from what we've seen from the animated series, or even what is mentioned in the books and such as well? Being pretty far removed from any cartoon live action touchstone that we've seen. What does this look like? What does society look like now? Up to this point, are the nations even formed yet? Are they still living on lion turtles as we saw in the Avatar 1 episodes during the Legend of Korra series? Who exactly is going to be the main antagonists throughout this game? Where exactly are going to be your companions? Are there even going to be companions? And I think one of the more interesting questions I have is what exactly are the spirits going to be up to during this time frame? I know when Avatar 1 happened, he sent a lot of the spirits back to the spirit world, but as we saw in Last Airbender, Legend of Korra, there were still spirits around, just kind of moseying about in the physical world, or they were able to enter through some type of portal or ritual of some kind. And so what are they going to be doing during this period? What exactly are their thoughts, their responses to this Ice Age, how people are operating during the Ice Age, things like that. I do think there's a lot of interesting side beats that could happen there that could really help to expand the world of Avatar overall. So, with that said, I like to think that the stage that we're in right now is sort of this dream space where we can just kind of hope and wish for a number of different things. Now, whether or not these things happen, well, that remains to be seen. But I do think it's a fun exercise to just think about the possibilities of what could be. And that's actually something that they mentioned during the podcast, is that they have a whole lineup of different games that they're sort of percolating on and wanting to release within the Avatar world. And so maybe these additional games can help to expand these things even further. But as of right now, for this announced open world RPGs, what are some of the things that I personally want to see? Well, one of the big things for me is I would love, very fluid traversal system using the different elements. I imagine this is a pretty big ask on the development side. I mean, I'm not a developer myself, so I can only really imagine how difficult that may seem. But I do think having an excellent traversal system, especially for a game like this, is something that could help make this a very memorable experience. When I think about traversal, I ultimately think about the Spider-Man games, and not just the most recent Spider-Man games that were on PS4, PS5, but even those back in the day that were made in connection to like the movies and such. But web swinging traversal has always been an absolutely amazing time. It's actually something that I still do on a fairly regular basis. If I kind of just need to be in a certain state of mind, I'll boot up the game and I won't progress the stories. I won't replay anything. I'll just simply traverse the city and web swing through. And on occasions, I'll help the random bystander and then just go about my day. But I do think web swinging is such a magical mechanic in terms of world traversal for a video game, that I would love to be able to see something like that for this Avatar open world game, to be able to utilize all the different elements: water, air, fire, earth, and be able to travel the world very freely and very fluidly, even between the different elements overall. Another example of utilizing or like cool traversal using elements that I thought was the first time I played the Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask and putting on the Zora mask and swimming through the water. That I can't speak to how it feels now. It's been a minute since I've played it, but I that was definitely a memorable experience for me overall. And so I would love for them to be able to nail this for this game as well. Now, the next ask or want that I have is going to be combat itself. Now, I imagine this could also be rather difficult, but I would want something rather fluid here as well. Something that would allow players to very quickly and easily change between all the different elements, and have it flow very smoothly, so that then players can truly embody being the avatar in these states. And the closest example I can think of is something like Devil May Cry, and how easy it is to just flip between all of Dante's different weapons. And on top of that, introduce in Devil May Cry 3 were the different styles in which you can kind of enter combat with, and that gave you a different set of abilities. But I think as the series progressed, they allowed you to change styles pretty freely in the middle of combat as well. And so I would want something like that, but for the use of the elements, to then by the time you reach the climax of the game, you truly feel like the avatar. So, another ask that I have, though, or that I'm sort of percolating on, is the story itself. So I do think this is where it's sort of like all bets are off and anything can really happen. But when I think about what we know from the different announcements that came out, with the general story beats that they're kind of leaning towards, I'll be honest, I have no idea where I kind of want this story to go. It's incredibly far removed from what we know, and so with that, it can really be anything, and I do think that that's actually a good thing. It's a completely clean slate for the developers to have a lot of freedom to kind of push certain boundaries or introduce new and different things, but without necessarily being entirely constrained by the established world, the established lore that we already know, right? And so the biggest example I can think of for something like this would be with Star Wars and the Knights of the Old Republic series. When when that was originally announced, it was, I might be getting this wrong, but it's maybe like 1,000 years prior to the events of like A New Hope and the Galactic Civil War and all of that. And with that, it allowed them to be able to tell a new story, but also still have a couple of different touch points that, or like, callbacks that echo to established canon, right? And so it was something that was familiar to draw people into the story itself or into the world, but what they were able to write and develop, that was what kept players deeply engaged with the story. And I don't think a lot of people disagree with this particular opinion, but like, the Knights of the Republic is probably considered one of the best Star Wars stories out there today, right? At least in my opinion. But like I said, I think a lot of people would agree with that. But in any case, I think with what Avatar is doing and being set 7,000 years into the past, I think they're opening themselves up to this level of freedom, right? And not being constrained by having to adhere to the full canon. It still adds a little bit of mystery. There is still going to be some murkiness out there that they can play with. And, with these types of things, I don't think I want them to necessarily answer too many things. I feel that can be somewhat of a dangerous game at time, because if you answer too many things at one time, or just in general, it doesn't even need to be at one time, but you also start setting up certain milestones in the overall narrative and lore of this world, right? And so, I mean, sometimes that can be good, but it can also be bad. It can be constraining in other ways. And so I think it becomes somewhat of a delicate balance of what can they answer that still adds a little bit of mystery to the world overall, right? I think something that could be interesting, and it is somewhat of a callback to the established lore, is talking about how certain animals came to be known as sort of like the masters of different elements. But as what was established in Legend of Korra, is that the ability to bend came from the lion turtles, and they were granted gifts. And so there could be somewhat of a conflicting point in those origin tales. And so I think that could be something that is explored even further. As for the overall main conflict of what's happening in this Avatar open world RPG, um, you know, it it could have something to do with ending this ice age, or maybe not. Maybe when everything is said and done, the ice age is still going, right? But I think it could be interesting to think about the ice age and whether or not it has some type of scientific element to it, or a mystic element as to why it's happening, or how it ultimately ends overall. Maybe it even involves like the Sun Warriors themselves. With all the Sun Warriors, this could actually be like the last sort of bastion on the planet, that is not hindered by the Ice Age. Okay, hold on. Sorry. Like I said, I had no idea where they could possibly go, but now I'm starting to percolate on some of these things. But okay, so it could be maybe the Ice Age is happening, and this means that likely the prominent bending ability or type that is, or like individuals that would be considered dangerous during this era would be people like the waterbenders, right? They have, because of the Ice Age being so readily available around the world, now they become somewhat of a force to be reckoned with, right? But this also allows them to move more freely throughout the world. And this could also help to later explain why we have waterbenders, not just in the North and South Pole, right, but also in the swamp. And this doesn't necessarily need to be something that's directly stated as, hey, here's why. But the audience can sort of infer that this is likely how it happened, and these folks were here when the Ice Age ultimately ended, whether or not it happens in this game. Now, another sort of general question I have, and it kind of dabbles into a want that I have with this game, is whether or not there's going to be a morality system, at least in the traditional sense. Um, I guess a follow up question to this is it is it even needed? I once upon a time, and for a really long time, I would have said yes, absolutely. Like for a game like this, an open world RPG, Western open world RPG, yes, I absolutely would have said 100% back in the day. But you know, over the last, or released last year, we had something like Hogwarts Legacy that came out, and while players could make certain decisions that were considered darker, so to speak. It wasn't your sort of typical morality system where the player could turn evil per se. And while this was initially frowned upon and mocked by online forums, at least from when I like where I was kind of scrolling through on Reddit and things like that, you know, um, last I checked, Hogwarts Legacies had a sale record of about like 24 million sold in its lifetime. And so while it would have been a nice feature to have, clearly with those sales numbers, it wasn't exactly needed per se, or it didn't necessarily hinder the overall story that was being told, that players couldn't enjoy the game, right? And to kind of bring it back to the Avatar world, and entering a morality system, I guess the question that could also be asked is, does it even make sense for this world, right? So, generally speaking, with canon lore, it was set up overall that the Avatar, no matter what, in every incarnation, is basically always good, right? First, it was established that they're always going to be good and work beyond any one particular nation or any one particular dimension, whether the physical world or the spiritual world, because they would have teachers, and then later established in the Legend of Korra, the Avatar is basically the corporalized version of the great spirit Rava, and so no matter what, being Rava, the Avatar is always going to be good, right? So maybe in that respect, we don't need a morality system, or we really can't have a morality system. But this actually kind of takes me back to some wishful thinking I had way back when. Back in I want to say like 2012 or so, when I think that was when the first season of Legend of Korra got released. But it just ended. I don't think it was greenlit at the time. From what I can recall, there was a lot of talk where it was basically supposed to be like a limited run series, and this was season one of Legend of Korra was basically supposed to be like a one off. But that I distinctly remember, that got me kind of percolating, asking, the all important question of like, what if, this or that happened in this world? And the one particular story, that I would have loved to have seen at that time was, this idea around a dark avatar. And my thoughts on the dark avatar was that this was an individual who ultimately was just so jaded by the world and its people that the Avatar, in all their wisdom and all their teachings, ultimately determined that the only way to bring peace to the realm was through extermination. Now, coincidentally, season 2 was um, officially announced and launched, and with what we ended up getting, it wasn't exactly what I had wanted with a dark Avatar. Um, but that's fine. I mean, it wasn't necessarily my favorite take on it, but I can accept it for what it is. But I still think that this scenario, this theory that I have, could play out in some respect or another. I think how we might be able to change this particular fantasy that I have for this is that the avatar or the individual themselves, right? They could be conflicting with this sort of inner spirit of Rava, um, and this is also kind of assuming that up until this point, 3,000 years after Avatar 1, that they still have some type of conversational connection between Avatar and the spirit itself. But I do think that could result in an interesting story beat. Another way that they could actually approach the morality system and bring about this sort of like dark Avatar type bit to it. Um, they could use a morality system similar to that of the Mass Effect games, where it's not just good or evil, light side or dark side, but Paragon or Renegade, right? And so the darker actions are not necessarily outright evil, but rather more code and calculated in a way. I like I said before, I don't necessarily read the comics or books, but my general understanding when it comes to the likes of like Avatar Kyoshi, for example, this particular avatar is known to be very, let's say, objective or very analytical in their decision making, but as a result, it comes off as being very harsh at times. And so I do think that could be a way that they approach a morality system for this open world RPG as well. But in any case, this was meant to be a shorter video, but I'm coming up on close to half an hour. So it's getting a little long in the tooth. So I'll just go ahead and wrap it up here. But yeah, those are kind of my general strings of consciousness when it comes to this open world RPG Avatar game. I really look forward to it overall, and I hope it's something that's truly amazing that can really show those who aren't necessarily fans of the cartoons or the comic books or what have you, that this is a truly fascinating world that has so much potential. And yeah, I can't wait for the official release. But in any case, like always, like, comment, and subscribe down below. But until next time, bye.